This is Daybreak Asia. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens. And Haidi, perhaps not something so much with market implications, but certainly that focus over the last couple of hours has been on that New York courtroom where Donald Trump is being convicted in an historic case.
Yeah, historic indeed. The first former president to be found guilty of crimes and all 34 charges when it comes to the falsification of business records to conceal these payments. And, Bill, you know, yes, this is a market that tends to kind of look through some of these shorter term domestic US political complications. But it is a complication as we get into November and all the implications in terms of both those swing voters and the logistics of how he continues to run for president from here.
Yeah, certainly a lot of questions and probably more questions that we've got answered at this stage. But we've got the open of Japan markets just coming online this morning here. A very busy day as well for Japanese economic data, and the most forward-looking one we've had coming through is the Tokyo inflation numbers. Actually, we saw a bit of a pickup over the course of May, so it does perhaps keep the BOJ on track for rate hikes. Other figures, though, coming through as well. We saw retail sales. There's also beat estimates. Industrial production numbers coming in a little bit weaker than what had been expected. The jobless rate holding fairly steady. So lots of economic data, as we said, but the one really, perhaps one of the primary focuses has been that Tokyo inflation, as I said, that acceleration over the course of May. What else we're tracking in the session so far? Well, Japanese yen, of course, always one really to note, but trading around that 157 mark. And you're seeing stocks coming online this morning just fractionally higher. So interesting as well, because overnight on Wall Street, it really was that story of those US GDP figures. They undershot estimates, concerns around the health of the US economy, concerns for corporate America, of course, in turn, and also question marks over where the Fed is really going to go with its rate settings, and hearing from a few different speakers from the FOMC. That's the state of play there for Japan, but let's shift to Korea as well, because stocks likewise just starting trading this morning. And again, you're seeing just a bit of upside creeping through, keeping a close watch as well on what's happening with the Korean won there today. Just slightly firmer against the greenback so far, Haidi.
Yeah, take a look at how we're setting up when it comes to the staggered open here in Sydney this Friday session. We saw quite a bit of suggestion that we would see some optimism right as we get into the end of the week. A little bit of upside, about 0.1% there. When it comes to treasuries as well, as of course we see that being reflected across Australian and Kiwi bonds as well. A little bit of underperformance for Australian bonds expected compared to treasuries, given the CPI print and given the higher chance of an RBA rate hike through to September after that inflation data. That's according to Westpac, but a little bit of wait and see still kind of being played out in these markets as well. Interestingly, we did also kind of get those comments from Sarah Hunter yesterday saying that the RBA does recognise that households are struggling, and therefore maybe there is a limit to what we see with rate hikes there. The Aussie dollar pretty steady, 66.29 at the minute, and of course, as I mentioned, we're watching US Treasuries in light of expectations going into the inflation print. Also watching oil as well. OPEC Plus working on that output cut accord that could go all the way into 2025. We're seeing a little bit of softness there in crude supply, very much in focus before that meeting. Let's get back to our top story, though. Donald Trump is calling the guilty verdict a disgrace after a New York jury convicted the former president on all 34 counts in his hush money trial. His sentencing has been set for just a few days before the Republican convention that's set to nominate him for another run at the White House.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Well, President Biden's campaign is also weighing in, saying it proves that no one is above the law. For more, let's bring our political news director, Jody Schneider. And Jody, in so many ways, we're in uncharted territory now in terms of how this, presumptive Republican nominee then proceeds from here in terms of how that campaign is run. We know that in terms of his supporters, this will probably just galvanise more support for him. What do you make of the implications, given there's so much we don't know about, whether he will in fact be sentenced to a jail term, for example?
Yeah, it is remarkable, Heidi. The fact that a former president, for the first time in history, was convicted on criminal charges. These are actual criminal charges in state court in New York, and the fact that he is the front runner for the Republican nominee, and that he has a very good chance of winning the presidency in November, and having been now as a convicted on criminal charges. It is remarkable. It's a historic day. We've never seen this before. We've never been here before in U.S. politics. The question that you raise, will it matter to a lot of voters? Probably not. We've talked to and had polled a lot of voters who have said they're sticking with their plans, but also according to the Bloomberg Morning Consult poll that we have been doing every month for the past 5 or so months, we have had a significant number of people say that their feelings about voting for Trump, for the former president, could be impacted if he were convicted of a crime. So that's what we'll be looking at. That's among swing state voters. They're the ones that are the most important. Those are the states where they could really make the difference on who wins in November. There's also the question of how Donald Trump will use this. So far, he's tried to say that the system was rigged. We heard that in his remarks that he made just after the verdict was announced, and that this is Joe Biden's fault, that he's taken the Department of Justice and other parts of the law enforcement apparatus in the U.S. and turned those against Donald Trump for political gain. He will certainly be making that argument going forward. Whether he can make it successfully in the fundraising aspect as well and with donors is another question.
Well, Jody, so far it does actually seem that there has been perhaps already, but also there could be further donations that come from Trump's most ardent supporters. Do you think, though, given the way that Trump is shaping this conviction or verdict as something that was rigged or a conspiracy against him, do you think that turns off any voters in this, particularly those ones that are undecided at this point in time, as you said, the ones in those swing states that could also really determine the outcome of that vote in November?
That's right. Yeah, and that's the real question for November, because, again, the base, both Joe Biden's base and Donald Trump's base, are probably not going to be affected by the outcome of a case like this, historic though it may be. But those independent voters, swing state voters, those who haven't made up their minds, and there still are plenty, a lot of people, even though this election seems to have been going on forever, won't make up their minds until the fall, until just the months before they vote. And by then, the question is, will this have an impact on those voters? And particularly voters who are not part of the base, who don't necessarily agree with a lot of the kinds of things Donald Trump has done in the past. Will this swing them to Joe Biden? There's not a lot of, we haven't seen a lot of enthusiasm for either candidate. And the question is, does this propel some into Biden's camp who say they just can't vote for a convicted criminal?
That was Bloomberg's political news director, Jody Schneider, there in Washington. And let's shift our attention now as well to any sort of possible market implications here. Bringing our Bloomberg executive editor for Asia markets, Paul Dobson. And Paul, we've been speaking about this already, that usually markets sort of tune out what's going on in Washington. Is this the case here, or do you think that this sort of injects possible greater volatility over the next few months?
Yeah, so it's certainly something that investors are going to have to pay attention to. I think at a very micro level, stocks that are related to Trump, his media arm, for example, did take a knock in after hours trading. But for the broader market, what we would typically look at maybe would be Mexican peso as a good barometer of future election risk. That didn't really move all that much. The commentary that we've got from market watchers seems to be so far, it's a long way ahead still. So when we get closer, maybe those considerations that Jody was talking about will come closer to mind and play more into the volatility. And also when we get the sentencing, maybe people will be able to get a clearer view of exactly what it might mean for markets. But right now, probably steady as she goes, just keep watching those headlines.
And in the meantime, of course, it's still down to US eco data, the inflation expectations, what we're hearing from Fed speakers.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be a big day today with the PCE data in the US session. That's what everybody's been waiting for all week, really. In fact, I had to go back to our Sunday and Monday stories to remind myself what we're looking for, which is particularly on a month-on-month basis, ex-energy, ex-housing, looking for a slowing down of the inflation in the US. So that would give market some encouragement that the Fed can get closer to cutting interest rates later in the year. On the other hand, an upside surprise, and we could just have another period of volatility in stocks and higher bond yields. This month, again, we've been through that cycle. We've seen it several times already this year, where at the start of the month, we had some hope. The Fed gave us some signals. We're still looking to cut interest rates. The bond market had a rally, and since then, we've kind of had another pullback. We've got 2-year yields got close to 5% again in the past couple of days. So still those worries and clouds hanging over us. Still people watching in the Fed commentary for any mentions of the possibility of hikes. That hasn't become a bigger theme for us yet, but people are a little bit on edge, and particularly going into this number, which is going to be really crucial today.
Our Bloomberg Executive Editor for Asia Markets, Paul Dobson there. And you can get a roundup of the stories you need to know to get today going in today's edition of Daybreak. Subscribers can find that at Daybreak Go on your terminals. It's also on the mobile in the Bloomberg Anywhere app. You can always play around with those settings so you just get the news on the industries and assets that you care about. This is Bloomberg. Well, defence ties between the US and China are set to take centre stage at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, which brings together global defence ministers, hundreds of delegates to address regional and international security challenges. Let's cross over to the summit, where Bloomberg Markets Asia anchor Haslinda Amin is standing by with our next guest, and those challenges has myriad.
Well, that's right, Haidi. You talked about tensions within the US and China. They say when the elephants fight, small nations like Singapore, like New Zealand, do suffer for it. Well, speaking of New Zealand, I have New Zealand's Defence Minister Judith Collins with me. Minister, good to have you with us.
Thank you for having us.
We know that New Zealand is inching ever closer to its traditional partners, the likes of the US, UK, Australia. Why is that? How much of that has to do with the fight between the US and China?
Well, no one should be surprised. We have been part of the Five Eyes Agreement for over 70 years. I mean, we have had long-standing and very real relationships security-wise with the UK, Australia, US and Canada. So no one should be surprised. We also have good, strong relationships with Singapore and Malaysia as part of the Five Powers relationship. So no one should be surprised. And just like Singapore, we are always very aware of tensions in the world, and that we need to get on and trade as well. So, we're just having to walk that line, which Singapore does.
But it is a China that wants to spread its influence, including in the Pacific. How worried are you about that?
I think we need to be very aware that New Zealand has a role, as does Australia and other countries in the South Pacific in particular. And we obviously want to be able to have regional security. So in terms of China, there are opportunities for China to work with nations that have already got long-standing commitments in the Pacific, rather than to not do that. So we think it's very important that we respect those Pacific nations, that we ask them what they need, that we help them where we can, and that we respect them as sovereign nations. And it does not do anyone any good if they're not absolutely sovereign.
But how challenging is it, given that China, it is, New Zealand's largest trading partner? We've seen how China clamped down on its beef exports to the country. I'm just wondering, how are you assessing that kind of balancing act?
Well, of course, financial security is something that is top of mind for many New Zealanders, but of course there is no financial security without actual security, and we certainly know that. I mean, I think we are doing a very good job of working with China and with our traditional security partners as well. It's just simply one of those things that as a small nation we have to be dexterous, but we should never be naive.
And in terms of security, strategic arrangements, we know New Zealand has made a bid to join AUKUS. Where are you with that negotiation?
Well, we haven't actually made a bid. What we have said is that we're interested in seeing what role we could play if we were invited to join. It would be AUKUS Pillar 2, which is the non-nuclear and tech area, mostly centred on defence tech. We have some areas that we could no doubt contribute to. We obviously have quite a lot of expertise in the space area, advanced aviation, and in terms of how old our own tech side. So there are some things we could do there, but whether or not it's in our
discussions, and when will you decide?
Look, they're nowhere really, other than discussions that we'd be interested to see what opportunities there might be. This is not, it hasn't been formalised into any particular negotiations or anything like that. We're just saying we're interested if there's something that's enough in it for us. But these are discussions that the Cabinet would need to come to, not something that a minister by themselves does.
If you do join AUKUS, is there a reason to think that you may need to increase your defence budget, which some say is just too little?
Well, we're really clear is that since about the 1990s, our defence budget as a percentage of GDP has been dropping, as many other countries did in the 1990s when the Berlin Wall had fallen and the world peace had broken out. So it is important, though, that we look at that. So we've got a plan that's coming to my office in the next few weeks, a defence capability plan to look forward to until 2040 on capital items and also other expenditure. So we're very aware that we need to increase our defence spending, but rather than just increase it, we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way where we can actually add value to our security partners.
But increasing your budget, what does that necessarily mean? Are you looking at perhaps 2% as recommended by NATO, for instance?
Yes, well, the Prime Minister, Chris Luxon, has been very clear that we need to move towards that. But again, it's not just thinking that we can, as a small nation, we have to be quite niche in what we do, and we have to be interoperable with our closest partner, Australia. So wherever we are, we're going to be looking at how we can be more interoperable, whether it is buying the same equipment, whether it's us buying some, them buying something else, but working in together. I mean, we have the Anzac spirit that goes back to World War I days. We still work very closely together.
But the thing is, Minister, people point to your aging assets. For instance, the Air Force 757s, which broke down and could not transport your Prime Minister. I mean, what kind of replacements are we anticipating? What kind of plans do you have in store?
Well, I mean, they are very old aircraft, 35 years old, so they've done great service, but no one's believing that that's going to last for much longer. So that is part of that capability plan, and so we are looking towards that. What are our needs? I'd also point out that occasionally other people's aircrafts also break down. But look, we're just simply not going to say we're going to put this amount of money in. We need to say what it is we're going to spend it on, how we're going to pay for it, and we are going to, though. We're living in a very difficult geopolitical time. We're very aware that things are changing in the world. We just have to look at Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the terrible devastation they've wrought on that country, and just know that things are not. We're not living in a benign strategic environment. We live in a very challenging geopolitical world. Yes, we are going to be looking to increase our defence spend as we can, but also with a plan rather than just throw some money at it.
Minister, Trump, in the news today, found guilty of all 34 felony counts, but it doesn't hinder his prospects of becoming a president of the United States. How would a Trump presidency impact relations between the US and New Zealand?
Well, I think that it hasn't occurred yet, so that's hypothetical, but whoever is the president of the United States will be a matter for the US people. New Zealand is not responsible for the voting in the United States. We will work with whoever is there. Our relationship with the United States goes back to about the 1870s in scientific work. I just think we just leave it to the US people.
All right, Minister, thank you so much for your time today. There you have it, New Zealand's Defence Minister Judith Collins joining us here at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and we're sending it back to you, Haidi. Belle.
Thanks, Haz. Yeah, that was Bloomberg's chief international correspondent for Southeast Asia, Haslinda Amin, with, as she said, Judith Collins, New Zealand Minister of Defence. And we're going to have a lot more from the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore later today. You can catch our interviews with the executive chairman of International Institute for Strategic Studies and the Lithuanian Prime Minister at the times that you can see here on the screen. And more ahead on Daybreak Asia as well. This is Bloomberg. All right, we're about 20 minutes into the session, or just over, for trading in Sydney, Seoul and Tokyo this morning. And we've got a few different movers that we're tracking here. The likes of Hype, for instance, you can see here that's dropping on a report that a court has barred the New Jeans producers removal here. That's the head of one of its music labels, Adore, as well. So the Seoul District Court saying late Thursday that Hype's evidence and rationale are not sufficient to back the case, or the company's case, for Min's dismissal. So you are just seeing that stock reaction coming through there. SK Inc., another name that we're tracking here, we actually have reports of a ruling on the chairman of the company's divorce, actually, and that includes around a $1 billion settlement, possibly to his wife. So we're hearing details of that. Stock has actually been jumping there as much as 10%. And other names we're tracking, Kansai Paint, Fuji Media. These are interesting because we're seeing signals of Japan's corporate governance reform in action here. So Kansai Paint, for instance, a buyback has been announced. So you are seeing, again, that big market reaction there. And Fuji Media as well reports that there's a push for an MBO to take place, and that's really coming through from some of its core investors there. Some of the latest stories we're tracking as well on the corporate front, and TikTok is actually pushing back at a Reuters report that says the social media platform is working on a clone of the app's recommendation algorithm for US users. The article says the end result may be a version that operates independently of Chinese parent ByteDance. In March, the US Congress passed a bill requiring a sale or ban of TikTok's US operations. Calling the report misleading, TikTok says the divestment required by Washington is not commercially nor legally possible. Apple is said to be planning to overhaul its Siri virtual assistant with more advanced artificial intelligence. Sources say the new system will allow Siri to take command of all the features within apps for the first time, with a revamp using large language models. Apple is set to unveil its AI strategy next month at its developers conference. Bloomberg sources say developer China Vanke is in advanced talks with major banks for a $6.9 billion loan. We're told discussions that are being led by ICBC started a few months ago after financial regulators instructed lenders to offer funding support to Vanke. If signed, it would be the largest bank loan issued in the Asia Pacific outside Japan, going back to 2022, Haidi.
Checking in how futures in Europe, Bell, are opening up for this Friday's session. We are seeing a little bit of upside when it comes to Asian stocks. Not much of that is being carried through, though. Some weakness across Eurostoxx 50 futures at the moment. German DAX futures also on the back foot. We did see a broadly higher session for European equities on Thursday. It was a rebound off that 3-week low, though, and just trimming those weekly declines. It does look like those broad-based gains might be given up a little bit, given we're still seeing that pressure from the recent surge in bond yields, despite some cooling there when it comes to the big move in those yields. In the previous session, we did see real estate telecom stocks seeing the sort of gains there, but of course the Stock 600 seeing its biggest one-day slide in just over a month. Taking a look at how US risk assets are trading, and this as of course we continue to look for market reaction to the historic news that Donald Trump has become the first former US president to be found guilty of these criminal charges related to the hush money payment to a porn star. This, of course, muddles the outlook as we get into just 5 months until Election Day in the United States, and the implications of when that sentencing will happen, what it will look like, and how that sort of complicates his path to try and return to the White House there. We're seeing US futures, S&P futures looking a little bit softer ahead of the inflation data. This is Bloomberg. Back to today's top story, Donald Trump being found guilty on all 34 counts in his hush money trial. Now the first former US president to become a convicted felon. Let's talk about this verdict with our US legal reporter, David Variakos, who joins us in New York. And David, really great to have you with us. So talk us through, that this obviously uncharted territory when it comes to where we go from here. But was this a surprise, and where do we go from here in terms of the expected sentencing?
Well, I would say it was not a particularly surprising verdict for those who sat through the trial. The evidence was very powerful that Trump engaged in a hush money scheme to hide, the story of Stormy Daniels, who said that she had an affair with Trump. Trump will be sentenced on July 11th in the same courtroom in Manhattan where he was convicted by the judge who oversaw the trial, Juan Merchan. It's unclear whether he'll get sentenced to prison or not. He faces up to 4 years, and he can still run for office as a convicted felon. He's expected to appeal, and it's unclear whether he'll be successful on that appeal. I would say that he still faces 3 other criminal trials. 2 of them relate to his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, and one of them relates to his handling of classified documents after he left office. So he's a long way from being out of the woods legally here.
So, David, how is this likely to play out then? Because we're also coming up against that US election deadline for early November. Is this something that's going to be really center stage, do you think, and really detract from the presidential campaign or election campaign?
That's the big question. No one can figure out whether this is going to really hurt his campaign or not. He has a very devoted base of tens of millions of followers who seem to love him no matter what he does and no matter what happens to him in court. He's lost 2 previous civil trials in the last year, and he's been able to turn this type of setback into a fundraising opportunity. He's continued to say that he's the victim of a Democratic witch hunt and that he's being persecuted for who he is. But this trial also showed that the American legal system works as it's designed to work, and that the trial went off essentially without a hitch. He had his day in court. He had an opportunity to testify, and he did not take it. So we'll see how the American public reacts to this verdict.
And of course, perhaps completely predictably from Donald Trump, we've heard these, grumblings that it was rigged, that he's an innocent man. There's also plenty of his supporters who would share that same view, right? In fact, even prominent investors like Bill Ackman saying that he agrees potentially with Ron DeSantis's view that this is a culmination of a legal process that's been bent to the political will of the actors involved. Is there any evidence or any kind of objective view that there could be truth or reason to this?
I was in the trial every day and saw the witnesses, saw how the judge handled it. His lawyers were able to confront his accusers and conduct vigorous cross-examinations. They filed legal motions to advance their position, just like any other defendant would do in that courthouse. So I don't think the jury was rigged. I don't think the outcome was predetermined. He had his opportunity to defend himself. Now, the defense objected to some of the judge's rulings, both during the trial and in the jury instructions before the deliberations began. So it's possible that he may have a chance on appeal. But in his other cases, and in this case, he's lost a number of legal rulings. So there's not, he hasn't had a lot of traction in these claims that the process is rigged against him. I should also add that because this happened in state court and not federal court, if he were to be elected again in November, he's not able to pardon himself, as he could in the 2 federal cases that are pending against him.
That was our US legal reporter there, David Voriakis in New York. Thanks very much for those insights there. Let's get more on this now and bring in Alexis Crowe. She's Global Head of Geopolitical Investing at PwC today from Tokyo. And Alexis, as we were just hearing there with David, it really seems like from a voter's perspective, a lot of the decisions are already cast, except for perhaps some swing states. But do you think that the countries in this region, within Asia, are really preparing enough for the odds that we do see Trump returning to the White House?
Heidi, thanks so much for having me on. You know, what's interesting is there's a forecast that we made when the incoming Biden team came into the White House was that you'd really see a change in tone, but not in stance, with regard to some of the protectionist measures that we've seen emanate from Washington, going back even to 2016 onwards and 2017 onwards. And certainly, I would say that there is an element of the French phrase of plus ça change, that if actually Trump comes in or Biden comes in, you're going to continue to see rising protectionist measures come out of Washington, not only to Asia Pacific, but also potentially looking to Europe.
And we've seen some of those instances actually overnight as well, because we had a Bloomberg scoop talking about possibly restrictions being placed on exports of chips and chip-making equipment or supplies to the Middle East with the likes of NVIDIA. Do you see perhaps that protectionism also applying not only to China, but also friends of China?
Certainly. I think one of the key phrases, of course, is the return of industrial policy. And we're seeing that pop up not only from Washington, we're seeing that pop up within Europe as well, where coming out of the economic shutdowns of the pandemic and the associated economic stops, many countries are stopping to assess what sectors are deemed to be of the utmost economic and national security. Now, the irony is, of course, that when we think about multinational corporations, when we think about investment pools of capital, that the know-how, the human capital, the prowess and the skills that are necessary to drive growth in some of these critical sectors, of course, don't just come from one jurisdiction. So actually, it's interesting as we think about some of the most, front-running and foresighted economies are actually those that are courting investment from different types of companies and from different types of countries in order to grow sustainably in these high-tech patterns of demand.
Alexis, you talk about this sort of post-pandemic emergence of shuttle economic diplomacy, which is really quite interesting. Do you think, as we see more of these charm offensives, that means that some of these alliances that we're seeing, particularly from a trade, supply chain and economic sense, are becoming more nuanced?
You know, it's interesting, Heidi, because you could say that as we kick off the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, that America has really retained a defense-first stance across the Asia-Pacific. China has retained very much an economic and trade-oriented stance across the Asia-Pacific. And there are other countries, I'm sitting in one, in Japan, that have really taken a growth and investment lens. And so, as we note, Kishida-san has really pursued this shuttle economic diplomacy across the globe. And it's fascinating, right? Well, a lot of headlines, are dominated by rising protectionist measures. Meanwhile, other political leaders and political leaders in waiting continue to conduct this shuttle diplomacy, creating significant opportunities in new and old economy sectors alike.
Alexis, we've been talking a little bit in depth about what next post-AI and, of course, that convergence when we get to the point where AI is then being kind of supersized by the powers of quantum computing. A lot of this conversation has been preparedness by corporations. Geographically, where do you see the countries and the policies that are sort of best placed to take advantage of this? Obviously, here in Australia, particularly the Queensland government, are making enormous investments.
Well, it's fascinating, right? Because AI is definitely, the investor theme du jour and the corporate allocation theme du jour. As we note, of course, quantum computing is potentially, we always have to look at where the next theme is down the horizon, and quantum is certainly one of those. Fascinating to note, an economy such as Japan, you have had a lot of government policies shaped at garnering pools of capital and know-how into these industries of the future. So the LDP having had a working group on semicon, which far predated the semicon crunch chip. Also sitting here in Japan, you have a concerted effort to significantly build out data centers. We're seeing Singapore position itself to do that within the Asia Pacific as well. Undersea cables, when we think about the rise of data sovereignty, so Japan and Singapore also positioning themselves to be data hubs in this rising land of data protectionism. And also we have to ask about the skills to match. What's fascinating to note is some of the US large tech companies have promised to upskill 3 billion people, or 3 million people in Japan, to be able to foster and generate the digital skills required to make this transition in leap. So we're seeing it happen across the board, and I would always just keep my eye on where the next theme is growing from.
Alexis, always great to chat with you. Alexis Crowe, Global Head of Global Political Investing at PwC. More to come here on Daybreak Asia. This is Bloomberg. The new CEO of top Japanese oil refiner ENEOS says he wants to take initiatives to improve diversity within the company. Tomohide Miyata also spoke to us exclusively about the company's future amid the continued weakness in the yen.
The weak yen has positive effects on our earnings. However, if the volatility is too large, it will impact the earnings and affect actual operations, which is not a good thing. Also, we get materials from overseas. The yen's depreciation has a certain effect in this area.
The 200 billion share buyback announced earlier this month was well received by the market. What priority do you place on improving capital efficiency? Is there a possibility of further share buybacks if profits are better than expected?
In terms of capital efficiency, since last year, we have been presenting a certain vision for both ROE and ROIC. We have been working on better returns for a long time and have decided to increase priority further with a buyback of 200 billion yen. As we would like our shareholders to continue supporting us, we want to respond to them as much as possible. And of course, we will continue to discuss further steps.
The midterm plan set a goal of increasing the number of female managers from current 58 to more than 100. This is hardly an ambitious target. What initiatives will be taken to improve the situation? Is there a risk that sexual misconduct by the executives in recent years will delay the achievement of the target?
As of April 1st, we made some personnel changes. The president of ENEOS Power, one of our major operating companies, is now a woman, as is the chief human resources officer. We also decided to appoint 4 other women at the managerial level, including at the head office. In Japan, there has never been a female refinery manager. The director of Kashima Petroleum's Kashima Refinery is now a woman, and I expect that she will lead the way in diversity in the future. I think we need to focus more on training and development, regardless of whether people are male or female. I myself would like to make a bigger push in diversity, which is very important. In the future, we need to change our company, especially as we're talking about carbon neutrality. We are also talking about ROE in the context of our desire to take another step forward in the global arena. Without diversity, I don't see a future for this company.
The use of hydrogen is not expanding as fast as expected. What are the issues? In April, ENEOS raised the price of hydrogen by 550 yen to 2,200 yen per kilogram. At this price, the fuel cost of fuel cell vehicles will be higher than that of hybrid vehicles. has ENEOS already given up on the idea of promoting hydrogen?
Basically, we started building hydrogen stations in 2014. We were thinking they will focus on heavy-duty trucks and buses. The situation is different in Europe. The CO2 price is totally different within their regulations. I spoke with the CEO of Air Liquide in Paris, and he told me they have 1,000 cabs there, which are Toyota's hydrogen model, the Mirai. The price of gasoline and the price of hydrogen will be similar. The reason for this is that CO2 prices and other factors will all come into play. If Japan goes this way in the future, carbon pricing will bring a little more green and blue energy into the country. I believe that hydrogen will naturally be a part of that. We would like to promote the overseas supply chain and local production for local hydrogen consumption in the future. So there is no talk of ENEOS pushing back on hydrogen.
That was the ENEOS CEO Tomohide Miyata speaking exclusively with Bloomberg's Tsuyoshi Inajima. And let's stick with Japan because we actually saw inflation in the capital, Tokyo, accelerating this month, potentially keeping the BOJ on track to consider another rate hike in the coming months. For more, let's bring in our Asia Economy and Government Senior Editor, Brian Fowler in Tokyo. And Brian, yeah, I was just taking a look here at the figures, and it was a little bit mixed because you saw, yes, a pickup and the headline, the core reading in line with estimates here, but that core reading, a little bit of softening. So what was your sort of read through on that?
Yeah, well, we had a whole storm of data this morning, and yeah, as you say, on the surface at least, a lot of it does look mixed. But if you dig into the details, I think it's actually a very robust package of statistics. On the Tokyo CPI, the key gauge we look at 1.9% is just below the BOJ's target. And as you said, the core actually slowed a little bit more than we thought. On the other hand, those statistics were distorted somewhat by the rollout of education subsidies in the previous month. You can see that looking at the service price growth in the capital was only about 0.7%. That's quite weak from what we've been looking at in previous months. But again, that's all related to the education subsidies. If you think about the nationwide CPI, Bloomberg Economics estimates that based on what we saw for Tokyo, the nationwide CPI figure would come out at about 3%, and we'll get those data in a couple of weeks. 3%, of course, is well above the BOJ's target and definitely keeps it on track for another rate hike in coming months.
Yeah, and we did hear from Governor Ueda earlier this week saying that there's scope for gradual tightening, right? So what's the sort of latest gauge of what this trajectory could look like?
Yeah, so we are right now conducting a survey of economists to get their latest feelings about it. But the main consensus is a hike in October, with another fairly sizable portion of economists looking at July. They all cite the risk of a possible hike in June, although very few actually expect that to happen. So I think we're continuing to look at how wage gains will affect prices. We also have tax cuts coming in June. That could give a push to both spending and prices. And then we'll also see utility subsidies phased out from this month. That could push up the utility cost component in price gauges and be one more factor that gives the BOJ a green light to go ahead and hike interest rates.
Our Asia Economy and Government Senior Editor Brian Fowler there in Tokyo, and you can watch us live and see our past interviews on our interactive TV function. That's at TV Go. You can also dive into any of the securities or the Bloomberg functions that we talk about. Joining on the conversation, you can send us instant messages during our shows. This is for Bloomberg subscribers only. Do check it out. It is at TV Go. This is Bloomberg.
Well, Haidi, the point's just being made. This is actually the end of an era of sorts, perhaps, today, because we're actually in the last ever block of Daybreak Asia, and starting Monday, there's actually a new show in store. Sherry Ann, she's in Tokyo. She's moved across from New York, and you guys are teaming up for a real look at the trading action. What's in store?
Yeah, and as you and I have been talking about, Belle, there's been so much focus, renewed focus really now with the Bank of Japan well on track to policy tightening and, of course, just the historic weakness that we continue to see in the yen. No better time than for Sherry to be on the ground in Tokyo. Bloomberg TV will be there to cover really all of the details, speaking to some of the top corporate newsmakers there as well and CEO, and really be there as we see this economic transition and how that's going to sort of impact Japan, particularly in light of the complex geopolitical environment that we continue to be in. And, you know, even the headline news on Donald Trump today really kind of just does suggest that what happens in November, some of the trade policies and the security policies, is really going to have a big impact on this part of the world for allies, for US allies like Japan and like Australia. Will be there every minute of the way, Belle.
Yeah, Haidi, certainly, as you said, that countdown to the US election and what that means for these parts or these countries in this part of the world as well. You've got that BOJ policy shift, as you said, and also changes perhaps underfoot with Australia and this sort of focus not only on the mining sector, but the new economy sectors that are likewise a big watch there.
Yeah, very, very exciting. But yes, of course, a little bit sad to say goodbye to Daybreak, which has been, our flagship show since we launched here in Sydney. But we'll be back on Monday morning, Hong Kong time, 7 a.m. with the very first episode of the Asia Trade. In the meantime, the markets keep marching on. So let's take a look at how US futures are reacting. We've been kind of looking pretty closely at US markets just in terms of if there's sort of any kind of sentiment change from what we've seen with that historic news of Donald Trump and his legal woes, of course. But at this point, this is a market that continues to look through domestic political colour, if you will. And of course, we have inflation data and some of the other Fed speak that we'll be watching out for as well in terms of where the trajectory for monetary policy goes from here. Futures are looking a little bit mixed throughout Asia, though. We are seeing Taiwan looking like we'll see a bit of a pop at the open. A50 China futures also seeing some upside of about 0.6%. There. Dollar China, one to watch, given just the big sort of a drag of weakness that we've seen when it comes to trading for the yuan, how that's played out for the weakness in the yen as well. Momentum very much firmly to the upside for this Friday session here in Asia. That is it from the last edition of Daybreak Asia. Our markets coverage continues. We look ahead to the start of trade in Hong Kong, Shanghai and Shenzhen. The China show is next. This is Bloomberg.